Actress Natalie Wood was found dead today. Her body was found floating here. Officials said she apparently drowned accidentally, but nothing further on the circumstances. It's a mystery that has haunted Hollywood for more than 4 decades. A story filled with glamour tragedy and questions that never found answers. On the cold November night of 1981, actress Natalie Wood, one of Hollywood's most beloved stars, vanished from a yacht off the coast of Catalina Island. Her body was found hours later, floating in the dark waters, dressed in a nightgown and a red jacket. She was only 43 years old. The world was stunned. The official report called it an accidental drowning, but whispers of something darker began almost immediately. Questions surrounded everyone on board that night. Natalie's husband, actor Robert Wagner, her Brainstorm co-star Christopher Walken, and the ship's captain, Dennis Davern. Rumors of jealousy arguments and betrayal swirled through the tabloids, but the truth seemed to sink with Natalie that night. For years, Robert Wagner stayed silent, insisting that her death was nothing more than a tragic accident. Yet as time passed and new details emerged, the cloud of suspicion never fully lifted. Detectives reopened the case, the media reignited speculation, and fans were left wondering what really happened that night. Now, at 95 years old, Robert Wagner has finally decided to speak. In his frail but determined voice, he has broken the silence that has shadowed him for over 40 years, confirming long-held rumors and revealing what truly transpired on that doomed yacht. What he admits changes everything. It's not a confession of guilt, but a revelation that brings new clarity to one of Hollywood's greatest unsolved mysteries. The evening of November 28, 1981, was meant to be a simple weekend escape, a moment of calm for Hollywood royalty. Natalie Wood, Robert Wagner, and a few close friends boarded their yacht, the Splendor, and set sail toward Catalina Island. To the world, they were one of Hollywood's golden couples, glamorous, successful, and seemingly happy. But beneath the surface of that picture-perfect image, tension had been simmering for years. Natalie Wood, known for her iconic roles in West Side Story and Rebel Without a Cause, had spent her entire life in the spotlight. She was adored by millions, but privately struggled with fear, particularly a lifelong terror of deep water. Ironically, it was that fear that made her mysterious drowning so haunting to those who knew her best. Robert Wagner, her husband and on-again, off-again love since the 1950s, had always been the steady presence in her life. Their love story was one of passion and volatility, the kind that could light up a room or explode without warning. That night, the couple was joined by actor Christopher Walken, who was co-starring with Natalie in her final film, Brainstorm. According to those who knew them, Walken and Natalie had developed a close friendship, which reportedly made Wagner uneasy. Witnesses later claimed the evening began peacefully, but took a dark turn after several bottles of wine were opened. Heated words were exchanged, laughter turned sharp, and the tension between Wagner and Walken became impossible to ignore. Captain Dennis Davern, who was on board that night, would later recount that the argument between the men grew so intense that Natalie tried to step away. At some point, she disappeared from sight. Hours later, her body was discovered floating less than a mile from the yacht. The news shocked Hollywood. Natalie Wood, the bright, beloved star with the enchanting smile, was gone. The initial investigation concluded that she had accidentally fallen overboard while trying to secure a dinghy, but even in those early hours, inconsistencies began to surface. Why had no one heard her scream? Why had it taken so long to call for help? And how could a woman with a crippling fear of water end up alone on the deck that night? The coroner's report offered few answers. It noted bruises on her arms and legs, scratches, and the presence of alcohol in her system, all consistent with a fall, but not conclusive. To the public, it was a tragic accident. To those who knew this couple, it was something far more complicated. In the days that followed, Robert Wagner maintained his innocence, visibly shattered during the funeral and avoiding interviews. Christopher Walken, equally shaken, withdrew from public comment entirely. The case was closed, quietly labeled accidental drowning, and life moved on. Or so it seemed, but rumors never truly died. Some said there had been a fight that night between Wagner and Natalie, that jealousy had ignited something terrible. Others claimed Walken and Wagner had clashed over Natalie's career. The captain, Dennis Davern, later told authorities that he had heard a violent argument and believed more had happened than anyone was willing to admit. For decades, the truth remained buried beneath silence and speculation. Yet the tragedy of Natalie Wood's death refused to fade. Every few years, new witnesses emerged, new theories were proposed, and the mystery only deepened. To many, the events on the Splendor symbolized the dark side of fame, how the pressure of celebrity jealousy and love can twist even the most glamorous lives into something tragic. And for Robert Wagner, the shadow of that night never left him. Though he rebuilt his career and tried to move forward, every interview, every mention of carried the weight of suspicion. But as the years passed and his health began to decline, Wagner decided the time had finally come to tell his side of the story. And what he revealed would stun everyone who thought they already knew the truth. The night of November 28, 1981, began like many others for Robert Wagner and Natalie Wood, glamorous, filled with laughter, and surrounded by friends. Yet by morning, that laughter would be replaced by silence, and one of Hollywood's brightest stars would be gone forever. Aboard the yacht, Splendor anchored near Catalina Island, the couple was joined by actor Christopher Walken and the yacht's captain, Dennis Davern. The group had spent the day socializing and drinking, but as the evening wore on, tensions began to rise in ways that would change everything. Accounts differ, but most agree that a heated argument broke out between Wagner and Wood. Walken later admitted that the conversation turned tense when Natalie expressed her desire to focus more on her career, something Wagner reportedly didn't take well. Davern, the yacht's captain, claimed that jealousy had flared. Robert accused Walken of flirting with his wife. The argument grew louder, echoing over the still waters. Moments later, silence. Natalie had a lifelong fear of dark water, a fear rooted in a childhood premonition that she would die drowning. She often spoke about it with unease, so when she vanished that night, no one could believe she had willingly gone near the yacht's dinghy. Around 7:30 the next morning, her body was found floating a mile away, dressed in a nightgown, socks, and a red jacket. The small inflatable boat, the dinghy Prince Valiant, was found nearby, gently rocking against the shore. The official autopsy ruled her death as accidental drowning and hypothermia, but questions quickly arose. How did she end up in the water? Why were there fresh bruises on her arms and body? Why did no one hear her fall? Witnesses from neighboring boats claimed they heard shouting, and even a woman screaming for help, but the timeline was murky and inconsistent. Robert Wagner's account added more confusion. He insisted he and Natalie had argued briefly, but when he realized she was missing, he assumed she had gone to bed. Only later, after searching the yacht, did he notice the dinghy was gone. "My world collapsed," he told investigators, describing the moment he realized Natalie was missing. Yet doubts lingered. Could a woman so terrified of deep water truly have tried to leave the yacht alone at midnight? For years, the tragedy remained sealed under a veil of grief. But in 2011, the case was reopened after Captain Davern changed his story, admitting he had lied in his original statement out of fear of Wagner's influence. He now claimed that an argument between Robert and Natalie had turned violent and that Robert had delayed calling for help. This revelation cast new light on old wounds, and once again placed Robert Wagner under public suspicion. Though no definitive proof ever emerged, that night aboard Splendor would haunt Robert forever. It was the night his world shattered, the night the love of his life disappeared into the dark waves, leaving behind questions that even 4 decades later remain unanswered. In the years following Natalie Wood's tragic death, Robert Wagner's life became a shadow of what it once was. Once adored as one of Hollywood's most charming leading men, he now carried a stigma that never fully faded. The official investigation closed quickly, labeling Natalie's death an accidental drowning, but whispers persisted. Fans, journalists, and even some of those close to the couple couldn't let go of the inconsistencies. Every interview, every public appearance Wagner made seemed haunted by the same unspoken question. What really happened that night, Robert did his best to move forward. He returned to acting, starring in shows like Heart to Heart, and presented himself as a devoted father to Natalie's daughters Natasha and Courtney. But no amount of work could erase the suspicion that followed him. Whenever Natalie's name came up, so did the dark cloud of that fateful night. In interviews, Robert often appeared stoic, yet his eyes betrayed a heaviness that no performance could hide. Then, decades later, the past came roaring back. In 2011, when Los Angeles authorities reopened the case, the label on Natalie's death certificate was quietly changed from accidental to undetermined. It was a small word, but one that carried enormous weight. The move reignited media scrutiny and public speculation. The yacht's captain, Dennis Davern, came forward with a bombshell claim. He believed Natalie and Robert's argument had turned violent and that Wagner had something to do with her death. The headlines were merciless. New evidence in Natalie Wood's mysterious death. They read, "Husband Robert Wagner, a person of interest." For Robert, it was like reliving the nightmare all over again. He vehemently denied any wrongdoing, insisting that the night had been nothing more than a tragic accident. But the more he defended himself, the more the public seemed to doubt him. Friends and co-stars who had known the couple well were torn. Some, like Jill St. John, who later became Robert's wife, stood by him fiercely. Others weren't so sure. One of Natalie's close friends admitted that Natalie had often expressed fear of water and confusion over Robert's temper. Rumors swirled about broken glasses, jealous outbursts, and moments of rage behind closed doors. But even with the reopened investigation, no charges were filed, no new evidence solidified the claims, and the truth remained maddeningly out of reach. Still, the renewed attention took its toll. Wagner, now an elderly man, found himself forced to relive a grief he'd spent decades trying to bury. In his autobiography, Pieces of My Heart, he addressed the tragedy with sorrow, writing, "No day goes by that I don't think of Natalie. I loved her with all my heart, and losing her was the darkest moment of my life." But for some, his words weren't enough. The haunting contradictions, the silence before the screams, the bruises on Natalie's body, the delay in reporting her missing, left the public divided. Some believed Wagner's guilt was emotional, not criminal, the burden of a man who argued with his wife and never got the chance to make things right. Others were convinced there was more to the story than he'd ever admitted. As the years passed, the case faded once more into Hollywood folklore. Yet the pain behind it remained as vivid as ever for Natalie's family, for Robert, and for the millions who had loved her on screen. It became not just a mystery of what happened that night, but a story about love, regret, and the unbearable weight of secrets that time refuses to erase. By the time Robert Wagner reached his mid-90s, the questions surrounding Natalie Wood's death had followed him for more than 4 decades. The tragedy had become inseparable from his name, a wound that never healed, no matter how many times he tried to explain or how many years passed. In recent interviews and through his memoirs, Wagner finally began to speak with a clarity that felt different, more reflective, and far less guarded than before. He no longer seemed like a man defending himself, but rather one coming to terms with a lifetime of grief. "I will never truly know what happened that night," Wagner admitted in one interview, his voice trembling with age and emotion. "I've asked myself every day, what if I'd done something differently? What if I'd checked on her sooner? Would she still be here?" Those words, simple yet heartbreaking, revealed the depth of the torment he had lived with. For years, he had been portrayed as the villain in a mystery that had no solution, that had no resolution. But behind the headlines was a man who had lost the love of his life and who could never escape the guilt that came with that loss. Natalie's daughter, Natasha Gregson Wagner, eventually became one of the few people to defend him publicly. "He loved my mother deeply," she said. "Whatever happened that night, it wasn't murder, it was tragedy." Her words carried weight not because they erased suspicion, but because they reminded the world that the story wasn't about courtroom evidence or tabloid theories. It was about a family fractured by sorrow. Wagner spent his final years away from the spotlight, living quietly and rarely making public appearances. Friends described him as frail but peaceful, finding some comfort in his grandchildren and his memories of Natalie. In his private writings, he confessed that not a day passed without him seeing her face. The laughter, the fire in her eyes, the way she could command a room without even trying. "She was my compass," he wrote, "and when she was gone, I was lost." In 2025, as his health declined, Robert finally spoke one last time about the night that changed everything. "People have called me a monster, a liar, a coward," he said softly. "But the truth is simpler than that. I was a man in love who made mistakes, and I've paid for them every day since." Those words, though not a confession of guilt, carried the weight of something deeper. Remorse, whether for his actions that night or simply for not being able to save her, no one will ever truly know. But for the first time, he seemed to let the world see the man behind the mystery, an old soul burdened by regret, yet finally ready to face it. When the news of his passing broke, tributes poured in from across Hollywood. Many remembered his charm, his career, and his enduring love story with Natalie Wood. Others revisited the questions that had haunted him for a lifetime. But perhaps at long last, both Robert and Natalie could find peace. Two Hollywood icons forever bound by love loss and a mystery that may never fully be solved. In the end, Robert Wagner's legacy is not one of guilt or innocence, but of humanity. Of a man who loved deeply, erred painfully, and spent his final years confronting the ghosts of his past. Whatever truth was buried beneath those waves off Catalina Island, one thing remains certain. Love and tragedy will forever define the story of Robert Wagner and Natalie Wood.